Introducing.
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Angela Coventry for accepting our invitation to participate in this celebration, to share this moment with us. And I would also like to thank the audience that follow us on YouTube. Angela Coventry is professor of philosophy at Portland State University. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2004. Her major area of research includes early modern philosophy. She's the author of two books on Hume's philosophy, namely Hume's Theory of Causation, a quasi-realist interpretation, 2006, and Hume, A Guide for Perplexed, 2007. And by the way, this book, we can find it in Portuguese. We have a translation for it. Today, she talks about the spatial and temporal dimensions of Hume on the passions. Without further delay, I now pass the floor to Professor Coventry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And, the first thing I got to say is congratulations on 20 years. And I just got to say, it's Livia's wisdom, her benevolence, her generous hospitality. Livia just provides the most warm, welcome embrace to study Hume. So it's my absolute pleasure and honor to come here for the Hume group. So I'm very excited about this celebration. And I'm going to talk today about something that I've actually always wanted to study a little bit more. And it's kind of at the very early stages of research. And so I'm really kind of interested in input because I have worked on space and time before. But one of the things that I always wanted to think about is what are the ramifications of Hume on space and time. So that's what I'm going to think about today. And in particular, what I'm interested in is how our ideas of space and time actually impact the intensity of our passions. Now, this is a common thing that people have in like general conversation. So we've got couples in long distance relationships, right? They tend to worry about how do I keep the passion of love alive when you've got this great spatial distance between us. You've got numerous refs on sayings like time heals all wounds. And that's going to suggest that feelings we have, like, anger or sadness or disappointment, that they actually fade or they lessen over time. My favorite quote actually comes from Pascal on this. He says that time heals griefs and quarrels simply because we change and we're no longer the same persons. And hopefully I'll end on that note. Now, David Hume actually devotes two sections to the various ways that space and time influence our passions. And this is in his first work, A Treatise of Human Nature. As far as I know, you don't see it in the later inquiries, but that's something that I'll probably look into. But it turns out that for Hume, anything that is closely related to us in space and time has a really powerful effect on our feelings. And if you've got distance in space and time, spatial or temporal distance, that tends to reduce the intensity of our feelings. Now, Hume also thinks that space and time actually interact with the passions differently. And that's partly because space and time have different properties. So part of his explanation is to show that, due to differences in space and time, we're going to see a difference in how space and time actually impact our passions. And the other thing is that the effects of space and time are actually relevant to Hume's morals and politics as well, because his morals and politics is grounded in the passions. And space and time have a massive influence on the passions. And so it turns out that space and time actually figure into morals and politics as well, in interesting ways. So that's what I want to talk about today. And then I've got this other thing, which is that you can actually see Hume's take on how space and time affect our feelings. You can see that echoed in many, many different areas of contemporary discussion. You can see it in economics, psychology, neuroscience, and also environmental policy. So the stuff that Hume is talking about is actually kind of widely recognized as phenomena that people are studying and experimenting. And that to me, I think is a happy result. And it actually makes sense. So let me just say, I'll just talk really briefly about what Hume means by space and time. What he means by the passions, and then I'll discuss some of the implications of how space-time interact with passions. Then I'll say how it connects to morals and politics. And, if I have time, I'll end with some kind of remarks on how Hume's view just has that enduring relevance still. But let me start with space and time. And this is like kind of a dodgy thing in Hume's system. Most scholars think that space and time is paradoxical, it's silly, it's uninteresting, it's subject to numerous objections. I'm going to just sidestep all of that because I'm just more interested in how does Hume actually use the doctrine later on in the treatise. But basically for Hume, space and time are made up of a finite number of simple and indivisible points or moments. So that means that Hume thinks there are minimal units of space and time, and they can't be divided any further by your senses or your imagination. So this is sometimes called the doctrine of minima visibilia. Now, Hume tells us actually how to experience a minimum point in space. And this is an experiment that you should totally do if you get the chance. I've done it a few times. You put a spot of ink on a piece of paper, and then you back away from the spot until you can no longer see it. And that moment, right before the spot vanishes, for Hume, that's an experience of a minimal point of space. And notice that it's perfectly indivisible. So it can't be divided. It doesn't actually have any spatial extension. But Hume says it can be sensed because it has a color attached to it, or you can actually feel it. So that means for Hume that space and time, so time is going to be made up of a similar number of indivisible units. And so that means that on the basis of this doctrine of minima visibilia, we get a view about how we form general ideas of space and time. So space is going to come from two senses. It comes from sight and touch. And that happens when we interact, Hume thinks, with what he calls the disposition of visible and tangible objects. So things we can see and things that we can touch. So objects themselves, these are complex impressions for Hume. And notice that the complex impressions are going to be made up of simple impressions. So objects are going to be composed of those finite atoms or corpuscles that are endowed with the color and solidity. So objects are like groups of points that kind of cluster together. And so the senses is going to give me complex impressions of objects, and they're going to be clusters of indivisible points, and they're going to be arranged in different ways, in one way or another. So I always think of it this way. You can think of an object that is nearby or next to, on top of, 10 feet away, 100 feet away. But notice that what we're doing is we're surveying complex impressions of objects and the varying distances between them. And so we're going to form, Hume thinks, a general idea of space just by the way that objects kind of appear to us in a certain manner of appearance. Now, time, Hume treats that differently, even though it's still a kind of a general idea that's made up of indivisible points. Hume thinks that time is different than space. And this is important for us because time and space affect our feelings differently, according to Hume. So time is different than space in two ways. Where you've got the idea of space, that is going to come from vision and touch. Okay, but the idea of time, that can actually come from many different kinds of impressions or ideas. So Hume says that time can be derived from a succession of our perceptions of every kind. So it could be an impression, it could be an idea, it could be an impression of reflection, it could be an impression of sensation. You can get actually the idea of time from any kind of experimental ideas and impressions at all. The other thing that is different about space and time is that space is defined by parts that coexist together. So I kind of think of a space that is filled with objects and varying distances between them. And notice that when I think about space, I'm thinking about parts that are existing together. But time isn't like that, according to Hume. Time is actually going to be composed of parts that aren't coexistent. And so that means that you get the idea of time from a succession of changeable objects. So you can only get the idea of time, Hume thinks, through experiencing change. And this means that if you have this repeated experience of a sequence or succession of objects that change, this sequence for Hume is going to be made up of those indivisible points or moments that you can't think of. It can't be any longer, it can't be any less. And these indivisible series of points that comprise, an object as it goes through change is going to appear to us in a certain successional manner. And it's actually going to be these differing properties of space and time that impact our emotions differently. So let's talk about the passions, right? So we said a little bit about what space and time are for Hume, but let's think about the passions. Remember that passions for Hume, these are impressions of reflection. And when you're talking about passions, you can't define them. You can't really put them into words. So because you can't define a passion, you can't put it into words, Hume says that you've got to identify them through their causes and effects. So we kind of look for describing the causal circumstances that give rise to the passions. And for Hume, the circumstances that give rise to passions, it usually happens after we've had an impression of pleasure or pain. So I'm going to have some kind of impression or pleasure or pain. And then after that, my mind forms a copy of that experience. And that impression is kind of stuck then in my faculty of memory, in my memory, but it also affects my faculty of imagination. So I'm going to have an experience of pleasure or pain, and that gets copied into my faculties of memory and imagination. And that copy for Hume is an idea. And when I recall the idea, then that means I'm going to have a new reflective impression, a new feeling that emerges. And so that can be a feeling of desire or aversion or hope or fear. So I always use the example of chocolate. So if you eat chocolate and you get like a pleasurable sensation from eating chocolate, substitute your favorite food. But then later on, you remember eating the chocolate and you're like, oh, I want some more chocolate, right? So that would be an impression of reflection. That's a desire for chocolate based on a past experience. Now, when you talk about Hume on the passions, it's very controversial. That he makes a lot of distinctions. Scholars dispute how to understand all the distinctions. I'm going to bypass all of that. The only distinction I'm interested in today is the distinction between calm and violent passions. Now, notice that when you're talking about calm and violent passions, here you're talking about Hume's famous criteria of force and vivacity. So this is like the felt intensity of the passion itself. So violent passions, these are the strong ones. These are the ones that are forcefully felt, and that includes for Hume love, hate, grief, joy, pride, and humility. But then you've got your calm passions, and these are weaker feelings, and that's going to include things like benevolence or the senses of morals or beauty for Hume. Now, notice that both kinds of passions, calm or violent, they both motivate our will and they make us act. So that definitely happens. But the violent passions tend to exert a much greater influence over our behavior. And the reason for that is because they're so forceful, they're intense. Now, what is important to know, especially for us actually, is that force and vivacity admits of degrees. So it's not a precise distinction for Hume. So calm passions, they may get very intense. They may hit like extreme passionate heights. And then, of course, on the other hand, some kind of strong impression may kind of fall into a softer emotion. So calm passions can be violent. Violent passions can turn calm. Hume keeps the distinction though, because he thinks that people commonly talk about passions like this. They commonly talk about, their passions being excited and taking them over. And so he wants to kind of preserve our common talk, like we commonly use vivacity to kind of talk about the passions. And so he sees it as a useful ordering, given the variety and extent of content we have in the mind. So here's one way we can kind of group passions together. Now, Hume is interested in what are the factors that make a passion calm or make a passion violent? So what kind of factors, are around that kind of tend to enliven or lessen the vivacity of the passions? And it turns out that space and time are actually two really important factors that impact the intensity of what we feel. Now, Hume thinks that, in fact, any object that is located spatially next to us or temporally with us right now, notice that this is going to have what he calls a peculiar force and vivacity. And so it's going to have a very strong influence on the imagination, right? So when I actually see Livia, notice that my imagination goes wild, right? I start thinking about, hey, remember we did this, remember? So notice that the mere presence, right, of Livia, not only can I see her, but we're together in time. Notice that this has a very intense effect on my imagination. So that means, notice anything close to us in space and time, it has our attention, it has force and vivacity. Now, the reason for this is because Hume thinks that at all times we have with ourselves a really lively conception of who we are. And because I've got this lively conception of myself at every moment, Hume thinks this is a natural instinct, by the way. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. I think this does have some important ramifications for thinking about the self. But because I have a lively idea of me, I'm concerned about me, I'm going to be really concerned about what is close to me in present in space and time. And so I'm going to transfer liveliness onto anything that is spatially and temporally close to me. I'm going to conceive of these things in a very vivid way. Now, so that means that if objects are really distant from us in space and time, so they're far away, they happened a long time ago, they're on the other side of the world, notice that this does not have the same kind of vivacity as something which is actually close to me. And Hume is really interested in why this happens. So why is it that, a great distance in space and time kind of leads to a loss of liveliness in our conceptions? And he gives 3 different kinds of explanations, so 3 different takes on it. So first of all, he thinks that distance in space and time, the reason why that has this reduction in vivacity is actually simply due to the number of mental steps required to move from the present to the remote. So it's difficult for us. And we know that, we don't like difficulty, we like ease. And so the reason why it's difficult for us, according to Hume, it partly has to do with thinking about the properties of space and time. So the imagination is always concerned with what is present in space and time. And it doesn't matter how much I try to think about things in the past or things that are remote, my passions and sensations are always going to push me back to reflect on the present. So Hume gives an example of, so imagine that you're thinking of an object that's in a really distant location. So I always think of this particular beach in Tasmania, very, very far away, very distant, right, from myself. And so when I think about that beach in relation to me, I have to have some kind of sense in my head of an overall layout. It's not precise, but, in some slight way, I kind of think of a general layout where there's the beach and this is me over here. Now, notice that I can join these points in my mind, but notice that if I think about, the beach that is the distant object from me, well then, because I'm thinking of the general layout, I've also got to think about an object that's between me and the beach. But notice that when I do that, I've started thinking about myself again. I'm pushed back to me. And Hume thinks that we have a constant kind of turn back or reflection on ourselves when we try to consider past history, or we try to think of objects that are very far away from us. Excuse me. So you've got like this constant return to yourself. So even if I'm going to think of, I've actually tried this, I'm going to think about the beach and I'm not going to think about myself. Well, that didn't last very long. Because notice that if I then think about an object that's in between me and the beach, I've already gone back to thinking about me. And then I'm already back to thinking about what is immediately present and close to me. And so the greater the distance in space and time, the greater number of steps the mind has to perform. And, the more mental effort that we have to exert into things for Hume leads to kind of a loss in vivacity. Excuse me. Sorry, my voice is leaving. Anyway. So that means that the effect is going to be proportional to distance. So the further away an object is, obviously the more points I've got to consider in between me and the object. The same with time. The further away something is in time, well, that's the more things that I have to go back in time and consider. So that means that the fewer the steps, the easier it is for me to think about things. The more steps, the harder it is, and that's going to lead to kind of a reduction of force and vivacity. So it's going to follow Hume thinks that our passions are much more influenced by what is close rather than distance in space and time. So that's like Hume's first explanation. Now, Hume also talks about why distance in time actually has a greater effect on us. So what he means by that is that time actually leads to a greater reduction of vivacity than space. So there's a difference between me thinking about something 20 years ago versus something that is halfway around the world, according to Hume. And so like 20 years, that's not a long time in the whole entire course of history, but I can't remember what I was doing 20 years ago, right? There's no vivacity attached to those ideas at all. So notice then for Hume, time seems to have a much greater effect on us in that it leads to a much lessening of the vivacity of ideas. Sorry, excuse me. So Hume thinks that the difference here actually is due to differences in properties of space and time. So our sensory experience, he thinks, makes it easier for us to hold an array of spatial points in mind than it is an array of temporal points. The parts of space, they kind of exist together as a union, whereas notice that the parts of time are successive and they don't coexist together because time is all about a succession of impressions of change. And so if I kind of survey a vast space, notice that this can give me association different kinds of spaces. So if I think about the beach, I can associate with that objects nearby the beach, objects nearby to me. And that's because I think of space as kind of like a union of parts together. And time isn't like that. The union of the parts of space appear to us, but you only get to kind of experience a single moment of time at once. So while I can think of all of space, I can only consider one moment of time, another moment of time, another moment of time. And because these parts of space, they're singular, they're alone, Hume says, they're not present together in the way that parts of space are, it makes it a lot more difficult for the mind to move from one to the other. So it's kind of spatial thinking is a bit easier for us, whereas thinking kind of back in time is actually much harder for the imagination to do, and that's just due to differences with how we understand space and time. So that means because you have this greater interruption, there's going to be a weakening of the force of ideas, and so consequently, it's going to have a weakening effect on the passions. So that's Hume's second point. Now, Hume's third point is that the past is actually associated with a greater reduction in vivacity than the future. And this is very interesting to me. So in other words, Hume thinks we're more concerned about the future than we are about the past. Now, Hume thinks there's an easy answer to this, the reason why, and that's because we can't will anything to do with the past. The past has happened and we can't change it. So he thinks that the nature of our will is forward-looking. The will is thinking about what it's going to do next. And notice that that means that you're going to have future influence. Future events have a much greater influence upon my will because my will is responsible for future actions. I can't actually do anything about the past at all. So that's going to be one explanation for Hume, why we care more about the future than the past. But also, Hume interestingly thinks that it's easier for the mind to go with the flow of time forward than backwards. So notice that your imagination, we're in the present, so we're in the present right now, And any kind of conception of something in the future or something in the past is going to have its starting point with me right now. And it's going to move either forward or backward in time. And Hume thinks that in nature, the movement is always from present to future. It's a forward movement. That means that when my thought goes from the present to the past, it's actually contrary to nature, actually contrary to the natural course of succession, Hume thinks. The movement forward in time, however, notice that follows the natural course of things, and that is going to allow us for an easy progression of ideas. And so that means that the very thought of the future is going to have a greater influence on the intensity of the passions than anything that's actually happened in the past. Now, as soon as I hear that Hume say that, I'm like, well, there's obviously got to be counterexamples to that. But remember that the distinction isn't exact for Hume. So there can be a variety in how people actually experience the passions in this way. But interestingly, Hume goes on, and this is very characteristic of Hume, especially in the treatise. He says, hey, guess what? There's 3 other phenomena that appear to be the reverse of this. This always happens in the treatise. He always has this view, and you're like, oh, that's interesting, but there's problems. And he goes, and here are all the problems with it. And you're like, okay, you've foreseen them once again. But what he was interested in is he actually thinks that there are 3 very similar phenomena to what we've just explained, but they appear in reverse. And it actually has to do with our feelings of love and esteem and admiration. Hume thinks that space and time actually influences our admiration and esteem of things. And it's kind of the reverse of the 3 phenomena that he just described. So, for example, he says that a great distance in space and time actually increases our feeling of esteem and admiration. And this is because of pleasure for Hume. So if I think about something that's really vast spatially, or I think about something really vast or long in a quantity of time, Hume says that the mind is elevated when I think about massive quantities of space and time. So he gives examples of, like, think about like a wide plain, or think about the ocean, the eternity, a succession of ages. When we kind of think about distance in that way, we like it. We actually get a kind of a mental satisfaction when we consider the greatness of the distance. And what we tend to do is we tend to naturally kind of transfer this pleasure onto the object. So the object doesn't even have to be close, far away from you to actually have that feeling. Hume gives the example of when you admire a distant traveler who's seen lots of things. They could be in the same room with you, but you're still kind of elevated by their travels and thinking about, the distance and so on. And he also gives the example of how, we really revere and admire a Greek medal, an ancient Greek medal. And I can admire that even if it's in the other room to me in another case. So something can be close by and I can still get excited and pleasure in thinking about how old this object is. And Hume says that notice that this is a case where space and time are actually affecting what we admire. And space and time actually, it turns out that a great distance is something that gives us pleasure. And so we get a satisfaction from the contemplation. But it's going to turn out, of course, that distance in time actually has a greater effect on us than distance in space. So that means that if I have an artifact from ancient times, I'm going to value that more than a table that I got from halfway around the world from another country. Something that is really old for Hume is better than something that it comes from somewhere very far away. And Hume says that this is, again, due to the mental challenge of the situation, because Hume thinks that when we're challenged and opposed, sometimes the mind is enlivened, right? We get excited. And as long as the difficulty is supportive and fulfilling, we keep going and we enjoy the satisfaction of knowing how old something actually is. So when we've actually got something that is invigorating to the mind, we're going to reach a state of mental elevation for Hume. And this is going to be different than the case of space and time, because remember that space appears to us as unified, that time is actually always broken and divided. And so that means that when I actually make the transition in my mind to going back in the past, it actually has a greater effect on my pleasure because I've challenged myself with the distance. So notice that the mental challenge of thinking about the past for Hume can actually have a very great effect on the imagination. And the reason why it has such a great effect is because of the elevation of the mind, the pleasure that I receive in kind of contemplating the distance of something. So that means that distance actually has a greater effect on us when it comes to admiring things. So the older it is, the more I'm going to admire it, according to Hume. So that's why he says we love relics of antiquity, right? That's why he says they're so precious to us. And Hume gives a similar explanation as to why the past has a greater effect on our feelings of admiration in the future. So Hume says that we admire our ancestors more than we admire imagined descendants. And that's precisely because we're challenged and we're invigorated by the difficulty of going against the past. So we're always situated at midpoint, remember, between the past and the future. We're at the present. The imagination, Hume says, notice he says it's easier to go into the future, but notice that when we do manage to go back in time, because that has a greater difficulty, we like it, we get pleasure and satisfaction. So it's going to have a greater influence on the imagination. So he says this elevated state kind of explains why we tend to admire our ancestors rather than our kind of imagined future progeny. Okay, so these are some of these. So these are 6 circumstances, right, that Hume has talked about, differing ways that space and time kind of affect the intensity of what we feel. Now, this has implications for morals and politics. Okay, important ones actually. Consider Hume's first point, right, that we have this preference to what is close and present to us rather than what is distant in space and time. Hume says that our feelings of sympathy tend to be livelier if that person is close to us. So that means, notice that if someone is far away from me, well, that means that I might possibly have lesser feelings of a degree of sympathy towards that person because they happen to be remote from me. Now, that's going to mean that emotional states of people that are located distant from us in space and time may have less effect upon our feelings. And Hume is aware that this could be a problem. It's actually a huge problem. It's a huge problem for an account of a sympathy-based morality. So Hume puts it this way. You've got this case where the degree of sympathy, it's going to vary. Hume says it's livelier when things are present and close to you than if they're distant in space and time. This is going to lead to variation when we make judgments of moral approval and disapproval. And one might think that sympathy is just too variable for us to be able to recognize moral virtue and vice in our own immediate circle, as well as to kind of think about complete strangers on the other side of the world, and also, you know, people that we judge in past history. So you might think that this kind of variability makes it impossible to have morality based on sympathy. Hume takes this up, and his answer is his famous kind of, you know, invoking the general or common point of view. So what that actually is going to kind of mean for human space and time is that when I'm like evaluating a person's character or action, and it's like someone who is remote from me in space and time, notice that if I'm going to adopt a general or common point of view, what that means is I've got to focus on the people within that sphere of the person's influence. So that means that I have to kind of go to their spatial and temporal location. So I abandon my own point of view and I kind of think about how to evaluate a situation by looking at how a person is affected by that person's character, by their actions. So I've got to think about people that are closely connected to the person I'm evaluating in space and time. And Hume thinks that these sorts of corrections, so then I kind of like imagine how someone is affected by behavior, and then I'm going to kind of sympathetically kind of think about what it's like to be the person in that situation when I'm dealing with evaluating a person's character or action. And so that Hume says we do similar judgments, corrections in all the time. We do it with the senses, we do it with beauty, and we also do it with morals. So even though I may not have, any particular feelings about someone that is far away, if I want to make a judgment about it, I have to enter into that situation. I have to let myself go and think about what's going on there, who's being affected, and what it's like for those people. Now, what I think is interesting about this is it's going to suggest that this natural tendency we have to really care about the present and not the remote, that's not fixed in us wholly, right? It can be altered. So we might have this natural bias towards it, but notice that it's not fixed, not set in stone for Hume. We can alter it. And Hume makes a similar point when it comes to the origin of government. So Hume's account of the origin of government actually begins with his account of the influence of space and time on the passions. So this kind of freaked me out when I realized. He starts with this natural human tendency that we have to prefer the present and the near versus the distant and the remote. And notice that this can lead to trouble because people may prefer lesser, although immediate advantages over the greater and more remote advantage of the maintenance and preservation of society. So basically, why it might be in my long-term interest to act, with the rules of justice. Notice that I might have this tendency as well to kind of prefer the present over the remote. And this can sometimes be for human error of thinking that can lead to detrimental consequences where I act against my own best interest. So lawful conduct, it might be in my best interest, but Hume says we get carried away with what he calls a narrowness of soul. A narrowness of soul where we prefer the present to what is actually going to happen in the future. And in these cases, we could act in contradiction to our own interests. And so to kind of correct these limitations of human nature, he says we need government, we need a system of government. And so government is actually required to curb our tendency for this short-term thinking because we can't overcome the weakness on our own and we can't change our nature. So that means that what we've got to do is change our situation and our circumstances, right? So we alter our circumstances so that following, the rules of justice, it's both in my short-term and in my long-term best interests. Now, Hume thinks that when we kind of give the power to execute justice, this is going to be securing us against the weakness of our own passions, our own weaknesses, our own passions. But it also secures us against the weaknesses and passions of other people who also tend to prefer the immediate over the remote. But it's not only can government kind of protect, conventions that are in our best interest, Hume says that government can also guide us to adopt new conventions. So that can result in some kind of common end or purpose that we're all seeking to attain together. So what this suggests to me, these cases of morals and politics, is that the natural tendency to be so influenced by space and time in the present, it can lead to mistakes in judgment in morals. It can lead us to actions against our own interests when we, live in a system of government. And we can't eliminate the tendency, but it can be restrained, can be corrected, but also it can be guided in different kinds of directions. And this is actually where I think the contemporary relevance of Hume's view starts to kick in. So far we've focused on Hume's explanation as to why our passions are more intensely affected by what's close to us in space and time rather than what is remote. But remember his second observation, and this is that due to differences between time and space, distance in time has a greater effect on the passions, in that there's a greater reduction of vivacity. So things in the past, these ideas are weaker, they're harder for me to conceive of. Now, this observation about the kind of the massive effect that time has, we can actually see this in a variety of fields today. So in behavioral economics, the impact of time has actually long been recognized as a domain in which the passions can have a huge sway over our decisions. And this has a long history that goes back to the work of Hume's good friend, Adam Smith. Notice that these sorts of decisions, they can affect your health, your happiness, and as Smith said, they can determine the economic prosperity of nations. So there are varied considerations that have this interplay of time and the passions, depending on the discipline that you're looking at. But what you see in something like behavioral economics, they call it time discounting. And this is the tendency of individuals to prefer immediate rewards in the present and to care less about the future. Even if actually the delayed reward is greater, we still care about something in the present than something later. That's related, this is something called time preference, which is pretty similar, but here we talk about the preference for immediate utility over a delayed utility. And so time discounting you see in many disciplines, and you see it in neuroeconomics, that requires consideration of future outcomes, time discounting. In behavioral finance, time discounting, it's all about how large a premium a person will place on enjoyment right now in time versus an enjoyment, delayed gratification in the future. And when it comes to, practicalities of decision making, many decisions that we face, saving for retirement and so on, these all involve weighing future outcomes versus immediate preferences. And in such cases, research clearly shows that people prefer immediate gains over long delayed gains. So work in neuroscience has found in the limbic reward related areas in the brain, we have greater activities actually recorded when a temporal choice actually gives us an immediate monetary reward. And it's much less when the only options are a delayed monetary reward. Now, temporal discounting is fundamental concern to environmental policy. A lot of scholars argue that environmental problems result from a conflict between our desire to prefer the immediate versus delayed rewards. And so some claim that this tendency to discount future outcomes is actually an evolved psychological trait. So if early humans spent too much time planning for the future, not enough time planning for actually going for what is immediately needed, then they were less likely to survive. They probably wouldn't live very long. So it does suggest that maybe we evolved this trait of kind of preferring the present over the remote because it serves us well in terms of our survival. But in any case, a lot of environmental policy scholars argue that because it's human nature to prefer the present, environmental policies need to take that into consideration. And if you don't take it into consideration, those environmental policies are going to fail. And there's a lot of really interesting literature on this, calls for people to value, the future needs of others, not realistic, it turns out. Public appeals to kind of consider future consequences of poor environmental behavior doesn't have very much effect on human behavior at all. So that means that if you're going to have effective environmental strategies, you actually have to take into consideration these natural features of human nature that, hey, we really care about what's in front of us, less so about what we can't see or what is far away from us. Now, there is some research that shows that you can have specific kinds of interventions, which usually involve changing circumstances, but you can make people place more weight on the future when making environmental decisions. And so that is going to suggest that our time discounting rates are not fixed, that we can actually adjust them. But to adjust them, it requires recognizing our shortcomings, but putting in strategies to overcome the natural kind of limitations of human nature. And there's a lot of stuff, by the way, on this. there's a lot of stuff on how to reduce time discounting bias, so much stuff. There's all kinds of strategies, primed future focus, mental stimulation of future experiences. There's even interactions with visual representations of your future self. These are all strategies that people look to kind of make us care more about the future. Now, notice that a lot of these studies, they do tend to show that it can be effective. There's some kind of far out there ones, but these are fun. Feeling powerful can help reduce time bias. So if I'm feeling powerful in the moment, then that means that I might actually care more about the future if I'm feeling powerful now. But also exposure to nature, that can also reduce a person's temporal discounting rates as well. So studies show that, your time discounting rates are lower after you've been exposed to scenes of a natural environment, as opposed to scenes of an urban landscape. And so the hypothesis is that the effect is owing that people place more value on the future after nature exposure. So I think this kind of research is in line with Hume's insight that this natural tendency of human nature to prefer the present and the near over the remote, it can be altered. It can be redirected. It can be changed, adjusted, not eliminated though. That's not going to happen for Hume. Now I want to make a last couple of connections here with Hume's third point. So we talked about how space and time, things that are remote, it's reduction in vivacity, more vivacity when things are present. Remember, Hume says, well, time has a greater effect on us. No surprise. You see tons of people worried about the role of time on the passions, and our tendency to prefer what is near versus what is remote, ramifications for various disciplines. But notice that Hume's third explanation is that the past is associated with a greater reduction in vivacity than the future. So he says we're more concerned with the future than the past. And he says this is natural, right? Given the forward nature of the will. I can't change, my will can't change the past, but my will can definitely do something in the future. And this is also, remember, driven by Hume's point that we always have this idea of ourselves that's lively with us all the time. This is Hume's account of self-concern. This is a natural instinct for Hume. And what self-concern does, it continually directs yourself to your own interests. So this is the sense of self that Hume recognizes as relevant for passion and action. And it's going to be my past experiences of things in the past that are pleasurable and painful that causes me to take a concern for my future pleasures and pains. So my memory of past pleasures and pains makes me very concerned about my future pleasures and pains. Hence, future action becomes very important for us. Now, Hume says that concern for future self, so future me, that's actually regulated by sympathy as well. So sympathy can go beyond the present moment, as we've already seen, right? So I can take myself and think about how are people being affected by that character and that action in another part of the world. Notice that I can also, through sympathy, sympathize with future me, and I can have concerns about future me. And so that means because the interests of myself in the future can be an object of concern, then that means it's going to influence my current actions. So a lot of my actions might be driven by what I see for myself that I want in the future. But it's not even just me that I can be concerned about future me. Hume thinks that I can also be concerned about the futures of other people too. And that also happens through sympathy. So this Hume's example here, I love this example. So he says, imagine if you see someone, a stranger, you don't know this person, and they're asleep in a field, they're about to be trampled by horses. And notice that already in my mind, I'm getting up and I'm running over them to stop them to save their life. I don't even know this person and they're not even feeling any pain right now. And I'm like, I'm going to stop the pain, right? This kind of happens like immediately. Now, notice that these sorts of observations that Hume makes about human nature, that we actually can have concern about future me, but we can also have concern about future people too, all through the same mechanism of sympathy. And I kind of think that this stuff might be useful to environmental policies, right? If we're kind of interested in implementing policy decisions that aim to give us circumstances to place more weight on the future, and when it comes to making decisions on the environment, well, maybe we've also got to think about other aspects of human nature that Hume recognizes, which is the ability of sympathy to go beyond the present and to care about things that are far away from you, that are distant in time, and to care about the future state of yourself, and to care about the future states of other people. And I think that could even be supplemented. Hume's got this lovely point that the natural environment is actually, this is one of the highest sources of pleasure for the human being. So he says we admire, the sunshine, soil, fields, mountains, forests, oceans, and all of that happens by sympathy. So I kind of feel like, environmental policy decisions, they might, look at Hume. If they're worried about how to make people concerned about the future, well, Hume actually has an explanation for how to get people concerned about the future. So that might be relevant. But I'll just end on one last point about Hume on the future. These days, this kind of tendency to care more about the future than the past, people call this future bias. Sorry, I've just been researching this. It's actually kind of interesting stuff. So we care more about pains and pleasures in our future than pains and pleasures in the past, right? And notice that Hume says, yeah, my experiences of pleasure and pain in the past make me very concerned about my pains and pleasures, right, in the future. And recent empirical research, this study just came out, says that people would prefer that a past self had undergone a horrific operation, a surgical operation, instead of the future self having the operation. Even if the operation was going to be 10 times more painful, they're willing to put that on the past self, but they don't want to have that experience in the future. And scholars take a variety of positions on this issue. So some people think it's rational to have a bias towards the future, so it's okay. Other people think it's actually irrational to have a bias towards the future. We shouldn't have it. You've got some mixed views, of course. So some people say that future bias is useful, even though it can lead us astray. But it's also actually been argued that to actually be rational requires complete temporal neutrality. So no time considerations whatsoever, right? So there's a variety of views on this. And I'm not going to say anything about that. But I just want to note 2 established points in empirical psychology on future bias that reflects Hume's view. First, there is overwhelming research in empirical psychology to demonstrate that most people are biased towards the future, right? Second, one of the main accepted explanations for this bias is the practical irrelevance of past, resulting from the fact that we can't change the past. And notice that that was Hume's point as to why we care more about the future than the past, is because the future has much more influence on the will. And the will naturally moves forward in time. It can't causally influence events in the past, so it is of a kind of a practical irrelevance. Now, let me just kind of sum up. I don't know how long I've gone, probably too long, but let me just conclude. So far, we know that Hume on space and time is not influential, but yet our counter space and time figures into some of his more prominent views on passions, morals, and politics. And moreover, aspects of his account of the use of space and time to understand the passions is actually applicable to a wide range of contemporary areas of discussion across disciplines, actually. And I think this range of influence is a really suitable result, given Hume's distinctive approach to the passions. Remember that he's interested in what are the causes and the effects of the violent and the calm passions. And he says these are really variable and they require many, many considerations. I've got to think about the individual person, their personality, their situation, their circumstances, their life history. And what makes things even worse, Hume says, is that calm passions can easily turn violent in a second. But also the violent passions may quickly calm down as well. So there's a lot of fluctuation, ups and downs with the intensity of the passions. And Hume actually thinks this is great. Hume actually says, bring it on. This is all for the better, actually. He says that the variety of the passions, he says, quote, diversifies human life. So the passions are actually what makes people different from each other. And it allows us as well, Hume thinks, to be different people at different times. And Hume is definitely seemed to be committed to that view. So that means that when we're kind of examining the various ways that space and time can act as intensifiers, right, of a person's feelings, that's actually going to help us better explain a wider range of our own and others' people's motivations and their behaviors. And so that's going to permit more scope, I think, for understanding the progression of our own selves, how I think about my past self, how I think about my present self, how I think about the future self, but not just actually about me, but also how I think about the progression of another person's self through space and time as well. And that, I think, is what's going to get you to kind of appreciate these sorts of individual differences between people, which Hume says is really, what makes the passions so important for us to think about. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Not sure.
Thank you.
I didn't talk too fast.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me talk about this. It's actually kind of a weird topic, but I think it's really fascinating.
It's fascinating. Wonderful.
I would like to thank you, Professor Coventry, for this enlightening talk. I'm sure everybody loves it. And I would like to say that we are open to questions on YouTube chat. And I know that Livia has one question already.
Yes.
Please,
I'm so excited. I think your work has a reach that is amazing, because it really makes a difference for the way in which we can live better and better leave a legacy for future generations. And
I've been thinking about this a lot, about what Hume would say about environmental policy and so on.
I think it's absolutely wonderful. I love it. I love it, and I love the kind of argument that you use, because it is about our good, our well-being in the natural environment. Not utilitarian arguments and not purely rational arguments. It's about who we are.
And I think a lot of that research suggests that, hey, you can't give someone a rational argument and expect them to, make good environmental decisions. You have to touch them somewhere else. And
yes, I think you're right.
A lot of the scholars seem to recognize that. But like they do reach their limitations, and I think that Hume can help us actually. I'm actually kind of astounded that Hume thinks we can synthesize.
I think you are absolutely right. But I have questions. My first question is this: our future bias may have a very simple explanation. By the way, your explanation of how we experience space and time, I think it's brilliant. How we basically experience space and time. And in this very simple way, we can explain also our future bias. Our future bias, I believe, has a lot to do with our physiology.
With our what? Sorry, you cut out there.
Physiology.
Physiology. Okay.
I don't think you have to go too far to see that we walk with two legs mostly ahead. We don't have 360 degrees eyes. So we are not insects. And our senses force us to look ahead without the need of thought and deliberation. It's it's how we are designed by nature. But I do think that our psychology is so very complicated that sometimes we are torn between past and future.
Yep.
And I do think that as much as we look forward, we look backward as well. And I don't think Hume pays enough attention to the angst of people who are prisoners of their past.
I was actually thinking about exactly the same thing. I'm like, what
You
if
know,
you can't move on, right?
and
You're stuck in the past.
I do think that when he explains our passions in relation to objects far away in space and time, except when he gives examples of objects that are subject to the emotion of the sublime, is giving us examples of experiences very much culturally embedded. A Greek wine is valuable for a Western society which finds its ancestry in the Greek civilization. If you go to Japan and remember the Hume Society in Japan, one sees those beautiful, beautiful temples that have been torn away again and again and rebuilt. Being ancient has no value at all.
I see. So for some people, that is valuable.
For some societies, for some cultures, being ancient and remaining ancient is valuable. For other societies, the newer, the better. It does not matter if it keeps the same architecture.
Who cares if it's 100 years old or a year old?
The function, what matters is the function. It's not the antiquity.
Well, that just brings in more variation then for Hume, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, and I think that he writes like a person who is cultured and who has to go through many steps to go from 18th century England to I don't know, to early Roman Empire through many historical steps. But a person who is well lettered, well informed in history, by a click of the imagination, makes this transition without any effort at all. Goes from Portland to ancient Rome with the same need that from Portland to Tokyo. It all depends on the unique experience, and I don't
Exactly.
know.
Well, I guess it's kind of a question as to how things have changed since Hume's time that
I
affect.
think so.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
But I would take Hume's
nothing.
optimism though that it's all for the better.
But I do
But
think
it
that
might
this
change
is
with
all.
future explanations.
Yeah, and I do think it's all very marginal to your main argument. And I think that this argument is very powerful and
It's
very.
important though, because if we wanna sort of, show that Hume's thoughts are relevant, we gotta get with the times. I was thinking about the very same things, right? So I was thinking about, well, I know people that wouldn't care about a Greek medal, no matter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is all marginal. The
Yeah,
core of your argument, I think it's very, very powerful. And
but the question is how can he deal with all of the variances? He seems to suggest bring it on in terms of variability. But there is still a question as to how we have to alter or change some of the things that he says. Um, some the stuff about memory I think is really interesting. But then of course he's got his sneaky point that of course there's because of variability amongst people, calm passions can be violent, violent can be calm. So it's entirely possible that people can have, very vivacious memories that are affecting their behavior. I think that's possible for Hume, but he doesn't talk about it. I think that's the kind of the frustrating aspect is doesn't talk about those sorts of counterexamples.
but we can work on sympathy, as you said, and
That seems to be
sympathy.
the core, I think, for Hume. It seems to
Yeah.
be, but then I kind of worry that sympathy does too much. But then, one
Well,
of
read.
well, I guess I think one of the other powerful things about Hume is that he doesn't have to bring in a lot of stuff to explain a whole lot of stuff. Like sympathy can explain so much. And he thinks it's better to have fewer principles than too many, right? It's easier. So I kind of like Hume's kind of reliance on sympathy to explain a lot. And I think the sympathy can explain variance as we move through into the future and as things change as we go along. So
Otherwise, we keep stuck in the same time, in the same place, without any possibility
well,
of moving.
I also wonder if some of this variation, Hume can kind of explain it due to his own distinctive account of space and time. Like they're not absolute things for Hume, space and time. They are relative.
No, no, of course. Yeah.
So maybe this is because people hate Hume on space and time, and I really love it. And so I'm always looking for ways that maybe it can be
Yeah.
a powerful thing for Hume's view, that his analysis of space and time can also kind of allow for different kinds of impressions and ideas to be relevant to the discussion, whereas maybe other accounts of space and time can't be as flexible as Hume's account. Yeah, it's an interesting thought too.
I think it's very flexible, and the standard of taste is the answer
Mm-hmm.
to this mobility that we achieve through the
Mm-hmm.
because we can appreciate of art from different times and different places,
Mm-hmm.
even though our sensibility has changed so very
Yeah.
much.
Well, as you said, I mean, Hume would have had to have actually traversed to see some great art. You actually have to go there to see it. It's not like that anymore. You can see anything you want around the world with a click of a button. I'm not sure what Hume would say about that overall, but that's another thing. I see
But
there's a
thank you.
I see
It's
there's a question on the
wonderful.
side. So
Thank
Carlotta
you.
has a question.
In fact, we have three
Oh,
questions.
okay.
I will send them by means of the chat. Okay.
Okay.
The first one is from Professor Franco Soares. Oh, and here.
Okay, so is our natural temperament as opposed to circumstance an obstacle to reason? I actually think it possibly could be for Hume, because when he talks about natural virtues and vices, notice that some of the natural virtues and vices that we have, some of them are very amenable to reasoning. So I think about good sense and so on. So some features of our natural temperament, our personality. So if I kind of a person that has a disposition to good sense, that can actually be probably not an obstacle, but it might be that other features that I have of my personality, they could be an obstacle to reason. So if I have a tendency to be rash or not think things through, those sorts of things could be obstacles. So I guess my answer is kind of like a yes and a no. Sometimes our natural temperament might be an obstacle to reason. So Hume talks about people that are naturally lazy. He says, which we kind of admire them a little bit sometimes. But something like naturally lazy, that can actually have detrimental consequences. And so we don't tend to admire that as a trait in a person. So I would say, yes, some of them are conducive to reason and some of them would not be conducive to reason when it comes to thinking about the force of the passions. I'm not sure if that helps.
Thank you so much. The second question is from Professor Andrea Cachel.
This is a good question. So the delicacy of taste and passion can regulate this influence of time and space. I like this question a lot because I want to say yes, but I'm not exactly sure how the answer goes for Hume right now. Because one of the things I've actually been thinking about yesterday and today actually is Hume's first account of correction, of course, occurs when he's talking about causal reasoning and how we can, correct our causal judgments. And he kind of suggests, that through regulation of our causal judgments, we can become pretty good at being causal reasoning. But he gives us rules for that. And notice that we don't get rules for morality, but he does talk about rules for art as well. And that can kind of help us kind of refine our aesthetic judgments. So I think that is a great topic. And that would be kind of thinking about how Hume thinks about rules for correction or regulation in the case of thinking about art or causal reasoning, and how that might actually work when it comes to thinking about the influence of space and time on our passions. As far as I know, Hume doesn't talk anything about that. And that was actually one thing I was thinking a lot about when I was reading it is, okay, so we're so worried about, the influence of this distance and space and time and so on. But Hume doesn't actually talk about how to correct it, except when you get to the moral judgments in the government. That's when Hume talks about how the bias can go too far and we correct it with external circumstances. But I think the more interesting question, and I think I get this from both of these questions, is how do I myself regulate my own understanding of how space and time are affecting me? And I think that is a fabulous question that I wish I had answers to. Livia?
Angie, remember something? Do you remember when he says that we are practicing something agreeable, time flies?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And when we are doing something boring, time is slow.
There's a lot of research on that too.
And that the other time, the time that the conventional measures of time are mere conventions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so all of that for me suggests that we can harness what we think of could be the adverse influence of these kind of natural aspects of ourselves, which I don't think we can change. I'm pretty sure. It's always going to be there.
So the last question, proposed by Professor Carlota Salgadinho. I send it to you.
Okay, correction of general rules of morals. Okay, so this is a similar question, right? So possibility so we can correct the judgments that we make about other people by putting ourselves in the shoes of others, taking ourselves out of it. So does that mean that we can have similar sort of process of correction for thinking about space and time? And I unfortunately, the real question is, how do you imagine this can be done concretely? And I'm not sure. But I do think that looking at the process of correction, I think probably the moral case is really interesting, because Hume actually talks specifically about us trying to get into the space and time of other people, which I'm assuming us being able to imagine that would not be possible unless his analysis of space and time is correct. But I think that looking at how we correct ourselves in the case of morals, maybe also Hume has some other stuff as well on the origin of government, about how to curb what sort of things we can implement to kind of curb our natural tendency for the present. I think maybe those strategies would be worth looking at as well. But I keep actually going back to Hume's explicit cases of correction in the case of sympathy, art, and causal judgments. I think that these are probably the three cases. And one of Hume's rules to judge cause and effect is that the object has to be nearby in space and time. So the rules themselves, the rules themselves are based in space and time. And I think actually Hume's account of personal identity, I think the account of time is relevant for that too. So that actually suggests that there's a lot of different places that we can look at to actually kind of, I kind of like this idea of thinking about possible corrective measures to correct our spatial and temporal thinking. I like that idea a lot. And part of the reason I like it is it's not something that Hume actually did himself, but I think that there's suggested parts of it in the work where we could actually extract something from that. So yeah, I think that is kind of it, that has elevated my mind. I'll put it that way. And we all like, the elevation of the mind is a great thing as long as we're feeling supported, right? And we can get invigorated by it, not discouraged. And I think there's something to that too. Like I see one of the reasons I'm interested in this topic is that it seems to have a lot of possibilities, a lot of things to explore that can connect things in Hume's account, as well as also connecting Hume to, the present as well.
Circumstances, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've actually guess it's actually been kind of obsessively when I wanted to think about this topic properly. Like I always kind of took note of it, but I never really thought about Hume's explanations. And I actually realized that now that not taking seriously Hume's account of space and time means that we're actually not appreciating sympathy and morality and politics on Hume's view. It's so central. It's space and time, those considerations drive why we, have government. The fact that we can, abandon our current space-time and, think about, what's going on in spatial and temporal dimensions of the future and the past, that blows my mind as well. But it actually strikes me as very important features of Hume's account. So could
That's
probably
wonderful.
keep going on and on.
No, that's great. Wonderful.
Do we have another question?
I'm very happy I've learned a lot.
I'm really happy you asked me, because it's been like these two sections in Hume, they don't really get a lot of attention. I couldn't find anyone who's really written much on it at all. And then it shocked me, because I'm like, well, you can't do the general point of view without space and time. You can't do it. Like it, none of Hume's morals and politics works without the space and time.
Yes.
So that's kind of a shocking result for me, actually, because I think we just tend to ignore it in Hume's treatise. So.
You know, G, this morning, two of the papers in the session about, no, three papers in the session about the meetings were about space and time.
Really? Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Good to hear.
But not about the passions. Them was about aesthetics, art. The other about memory.
Well, and
Andreas,
memory is really important as well.
in literature, memory in literature. In that French writer, what's his name?
Malebranche? I don't know. He just popped into my head.
Oh, famous French writer who used to eat Marcel Proust.
Oh, okay.
And Andrea Cachel's was about. She's the one who sent you the question you liked.
Oh, okay. Well, I liked all of them, but yes, yeah.
She's working on space and time as well.
Okay. Well, that is fantastic to hear.
This is so happy. It's such a happy encounter.
I'm excited because, you know, sometimes when you try to figure something out in Hume, you feel all on your own. And it's
no, you are not. You are not alone. Truth is out there.
I was actually, when I went searching, I was actually kind of surprised that the secondary literature didn't really help me with the questions that I was seeking, you know, or were trying to find answers to. It didn't really help me. I actually found the contemporary literature helped me understand maybe what he was talking about sometimes, which kind of surprised me as well. But no, I think that I'm glad to hear. I mean, obviously, space and time has become more of a thing than it used to be. You know, because we've got, you know, Don Baxter's book on it.
Yeah, but
it's become more of a thing, and people have done a lot of great historical, sympathetic work on space and time. But now I think we've got to think about how it really figures into Hume's overall views. And you know,
each of you had a very different out, and it was very, very beautiful, don't you think?
I think that is beautiful. I think that is exactly the right result. That it should have very different outcomes. I'm kind of excited by Hume's point. Hume's point that, you know, we shouldn't be discouraged by variability. It should excite us. It enlarges us. You know,
that's very true.
And the fact that Hume can accommodate those points, I think, is a good thing. So. There's that great quote where he says, you know, the progress of our sentiments, it goes as far as we take it. And who knows what we're going to, you know, have sentiments about right in the future. Maybe that's why Hume is so irresistible to kind of bring to contemporary topics. Because he's just describing now, but he's like, who knows what we might value, feelings
towards.
A little
bit, yeah. Still a little bit of a rebellious chap.
Yes. And the fact that he can offer a view that is so flexible, we can still, and in so many different areas. I thought that also, but it should be, right? Human nature is applicable to everything that we do.
Exactly.
And we are seeing more attention to it, I think, in other areas. But I've noticed that it's actually Adam Smith who gets all the credit in economics So I've actually been trying to read a little bit more of Smith as well, because he's had a huge influence. It's huge. And so that's easy to find stuff on Smith, his influence in economics.
Well,
It's harder to find stuff for you.
I tried,
Exactly. You try. Exactly.
and I honestly, it's not philosophy. It's very how can I say it? You begin to read and you ask, why? Oh, why?
Mm,
you know?
mhm, mhm.
And
Whereas where humans always asking why?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's so it's economics. It's not philosophy,
Uh-huh.
and,
Uh-huh.
and it's pre-capitalist, Ca- pre that is pre-neoliberal capitalism.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
So it's of no use to us,
Well, and notice
I
that
believe.
Hume is only interested in it in certain subject matters, right? I actually should check out, which is a reminder, I should check out one piece of Hume on economics that where maybe he talks about it. But notice that he's more interested in talking about the subjects that concern us most, right?
Yeah.
Morals, passions, the things
So
that
we're
threaten.
telling when you are telling us that we are more interested in our present gratification, and they state the government should remind us of our future good, future interest. I think of the very poor societies that we find around the globe nowadays. People have no choice other than to be
And to
very much concerned about
right,
their present
right. Well, I mean,
survival.
that actually brings out another point, another, I think, important point. And, depending on your circumstances, future bias is
Yeah.
a rational thing. I'm not
Uh,
sure. I don't know that whole debate about future bias, is it rational, irrational, mixed views. I mean,
yeah.
I,
This is a so very much 18th century haven,
mhm,
beauty, happiness.
right,
That
right.
if you look at some parts of the globe nowadays,
Hmm.
it would be
No, that's a good point.
easy to ask such questions.
Yeah, well, and
Because
also,
people have no choice.
exactly, you don't have any choice. You don't, also your circumstances might be that you don't get a choice as to what kind of, society that you're born into, what kind of government. You don't have a choice over any.
Yeah, they are in survival mode.
Mhm. Yeah, so actually when I was
So,
reading some of that stuff, and they talk about, hey, when you're being rational, you just put time aside. I'm just like, are these things even possible? Is this the realm where we're taught philosophy, but it just has no effect on us?
yeah,
I did feel a little bit
very,
like that. You need a situation, you need an example to get Hume going. You can't just talk about, hey, we just need to be temporal neutral all the time. It's just like, does that really fit with who we are as humans? No.
yes.
And that's also what I like about Hume, is that he also reminds us, okay, so, is that humanly possible for us? Can we
Yes, I
suspend
love it.
judgment about that? Like, no, we can't. And so our circumstances might dictate that we're not in a position to, be, completely neutral and time biased. We just don't have
And
that luxury.
and he remains relevant exactly because he opens our thoughts to these many possibilities.
Exactly. And we embrace the many possibilities.
He's wonderful.
Yeah. So it's kind of reminds me of the way he proceeds in the treatise. I was very aggravated again by it, because he always says, he gives you these beautiful, deep arguments, and then he's got, and here are all these things that are against it. And you're like, no. But then he's like, but I can explain
Yeah.
why. And you're like, it's just like this long road with Hume, but it's always somehow worth it in the end.
So beautiful.
Yeah.
So beautiful. Gosh, I was a bit lazy about reading Hume again. Now I feel more um, passionate about reading Hume again. Thank
Well,
you.
it's not easy, is it? When you read the same books over and over for a living. Sometimes it takes I actually found myself I was like, I'm never going to think about space and time again. I am so back into it, and I never really expected it to kind of crop up again. And it was partly because I just realized that we tend to make assumptions about space and time and feelings. It's kind of like embedded in our language, but I've never actually really thought about it. I've never actually really thought about how space and time might be impacting the way that I'm feeling. And it's actually a very useful exercise as well. So
Thank you.
thank you
so much.
Thank you. So what else is going on with you guys today?
We are ending now. This is the last talk of the day. We would like to thank you once again for this beautiful talk. And of course, we would like to invite you and the audience that follow us on YouTube to come back tomorrow. We are starting in the morning with a talk of Alana. Alana Cafe will present us a lecture and we invite you to come back.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Olivia, would you like to say the goodbye words of the day?
No, you guys, you are the heroes of this event.
So that's it. That's all. Então amanhã nós voltamos, na parte da manhã, às 8h30. Agradecemos a participação de todos vocês e isso é tudo. Uma boa tarde para todos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ciao.